been a part of our culture. It's been a part of our history for a long time now, even from the very beginning of those who came to our country back in 1621, if you believe in such things as history. There's the communication that on that first winter, after they had survived all of the challenges of that year, that they sat down and they were thankful for what they had. During the battle that was going on for our nation's beginning, the Revolutionary War, George Washington called the entire country, both when he was General Washington and then again once when he was President Washington, for our nation to come and sit down and be thankful for what God was doing in the creation of our country. So whether it was the 1600s or the 1700s, or even with the proclamation that made Thanksgiving a national holiday celebrated on that fourth Thursday of the month, when Abraham Lincoln, during the middle of the Civil War, said this, that he was going to proclaim a day of thanksgiving to our sovereign God. It's been in our heritage as a country to sit down and be thankful, not for just what we have, but for the one who has given that to us. And you and I, as believers in Christ Jesus, we should be at the forefront in our culture today, reminding people of the importance and the value of sitting in the Thanksgiving chair, that we might be thankful for all that God has done for us as a country. Because so many times we forget all of the blessings we really have. And it's not until we're forced by the calendar or by other people that we begin to count, as the song says, our many blessings and begin to name them one by one, that we sit down in such a chair. And if I forced you this morning, I bet that there are some things that you can be thankful for that are not at the surface of your mind, but once you are forced to push past them, you might be able to think of some things and some reasons for you to be thankful today. And I would be remiss if I did not challenge you to do that and ask you to think about some of the things that you should be thankful for. So this morning, I want to give you 30 seconds of my sermon time to think about something that you should be thankful for. Okay, go. Great-grandchildren. Somebody's even going to name them this morning. All right. See, I wasn't even going to give you 30 seconds. I was going to give you about 12 and then just take back over because time is so precious to me. But it doesn't take long, does it, for you to begin to think of something to be thankful for? Well, this morning what I want to do is push you past simply sitting down in the average American Thanksgiving chair. Because for most of us, when I say, what do you have to be thankful for, you will come up with a time or something where it has been good for you. Last night, I'm watching the Razorbacks, and I know I really shouldn't on Saturday night because I know that has a way of tendency to spread my feeling on the next morning. But it was that we were thankful to get the win out of the end of that game. Yes, amen. There are some Razorback fans. I mean, we fire Houston up because he runs the ball all the time. Bobby Petrino, 6 run, never mind. I'm sorry. Pull it back together here. But so many times when we're thankful for something that is positive. We are thankful for something that has gone our way. We are thankful that we're happy and that we're well and that we've got a job and that we've got money. And we are thankful for when God sweeps in and saves the day. And that's what you always hear about. But this morning as believers, I want to push you just a little bit further than that. See, I want to push you to what Matthew 5:41 says. You remember this passage, don't you? Jesus is talking about how believers are supposed to be different than the culture. We're not supposed to be like everybody else. We're, in fact, supposed to go that second mile. You'll know the context of this. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, you know the history of this. At that time, during the Roman Greco world, the Roman Greco soldiers could have you stop what you were doing, and they could force you to walk or to carry their pack or their stuff 1 mile. They had that right. In fact, that's why when someone pulls Simon Cyrene out of the crowd to carry the cross of Christ, he has to do this because that is under obligation to the government at that time. And so any person could force you to stop what you were doing, any soldier, and you have to carry their stuff for 1 mile. But Jesus said, if you really are a follower of me, you're going to go beyond what is expected. You're going to go beyond what is required of you. You are, in fact, to go that extra or that second mile. Well, today what I want to challenge you is to go that second mile in giving thanks. And we're going to pull our context today from the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so if you've got a Bible, if you want to join me there, we're going to be looking at a particular passage that reminds us that, yes, we should all sit down in the Thanksgiving chair. Because all of us, if we're not careful, will forget all of the wonderful things that God has done, all the incredible blessings that you and I have been given by God. Yes, we may not have everything that we think we want or think that we need, but God has provided everything that we could possibly ever want. And yet, if that is all we do in the Thanksgiving chair, we have missed completely what it really means to be a believer, because here's what the challenge is. Today, it is going to be seemingly Christian to remember Thanksgiving. It's going to be seemingly Christian to fight against the culture and to be thankful for things. And that is good and that is fine, but that is only the first mile. And the Apostle Paul, in the second letter to the Corinthians, gives us some insight as to what we really ought to be thankful for, because Thanksgiving is not just about, hey, God, thanks for the good stuff because you make me feel good, but it goes something way beyond that. Now, you may or may not know that this is one of several letters that were written by Paul to the church in Corinth. You might recall that Corinth was a pretty important city within the Greco-Roman Empire in times. Because of its physical location, it was a place where a lot of the travel and a lot of the trade would go through. In fact, if you wanted to move goods from one part of the Roman Empire to the next part of the Roman Empire, it would be very difficult to avoid going through Corinth. You could, but it would be like a 20-mile waterway journey around that particular location. And so just about everything happened in Corinth. Everything went through there. All kinds of people, all kinds of traders, all kind of cultic activity. It was the center place of all things culture. In fact, it was so devastating that it not only was it all things culture, but it was so corrupt and so vile that when someone wanted to slam you, as people would say in the 80s, I don't know what they say today, but if someone wanted to disparage you or to make you feel bad, they would call you a Corinthian. And yet it's in this letter that Paul has begun to have this conversation with the church that he began. Paul, when he went to Corinth, on the beginning of his second missionary journey, spent 18 months with the people at Corinth. And he poured into them the things of Christ, and he taught them time and time and time again, spending 18 months there. He had written a letter to them before, as he left that time, which we don't have. It's considered the lost letter, because he refers to that in the book of the 1 Corinthians, or 1 Corinthians we call it today. And then after that, they requested some more information, so he sends them the letter of 1 Corinthians. During the meantime, though, after he sends this letter, some things have happened within that church, and there have been people who've come in who don't really agree with Paul. In fact, they begin to talk badly of Paul, and so much so that Paul has to make a visit to this particular church that he's poured his life into, and they reject him when he gets there. So he is heartbroken because of that, and he leaves that area, and then he writes what we call the severe letter, or the harsh letter, which we don't have a copy of because it probably had a little more Paul in it than it had the Holy Spirit. But he sends this letter back to them saying, you've lost it, you don't understand what's happening, and really kind of berates them. It just destroys them, attacks them, and begs them to respond. And in fact, they do respond. And then Paul writes this very intensely emotional letter, really revealing a lot about who he is to them. And part of what he's doing, really beginning in about verse 19 of chapter 11, is he's spending a lot of time defending himself. And he begins to tell them, some of his credentials and why the things that those other guys were saying about him weren't quite accurate. And he's talking about how God has been using him in his life. And he could really boast about all these incredible things that he had gone through and experiences and God's blessings on him. And then he comes to this part in the chapter 12 where he says, therefore, I could be boasting about all these kind of things. In fact, he lists a lot of those things that he could be boasting about. But he says, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. You're probably familiar with this passage. How many of you are familiar with the thorn in the flesh of Paul? Yeah, most of us are oftentimes familiar with this passage. What you may or may not know is that the word thorn there is probably not a very good translation. It's better translated stake. Now, not a ribeye or a T-bone, but one of those other kind of like a tent steak kind of an idea, okay? This word, scopolos, I think is that particular word, is the only time it's used in the entire New Testament, that word thorn. So we don't really have any kind of context to understand what Paul is really talking about here, but we know that it's pretty painful, and while a thorn in the flesh can be painful, there's no doubt about that, I think that probably a stake in the flesh would probably be a little more painful. So he's trying to talk about that he has got this intense pain, and there has been much, much debate within Christian scholarship as to what this thorn was. Some will say that it's some kind of physical ailment. In fact, many would argue that there might have been something wrong with Paul's eyesight, because there's a couple of things where he's using somebody to write for him, and amanuensis is what they call that, or something like that, some fancy word, where he's not able to write, and then sometimes he will say, but you can see it, it's in my own handwriting. So some have suggested that it was Paul's losing his sight. Maybe he was becoming blind over time. In fact, there's one time that whether he's being sarcastic or not, he doesn't recognize the high priest in one of the conversations. And so we don't know if that's the case or not. Some would argue that it's maybe more of an epileptic condition and that he has some kind of fit of some type. Some have even suggested maybe it was a struggle with sin, which I don't buy that. But John MacArthur will point out that right after a thorn in my flesh, he refers to a messenger of Satan, and some would argue that this is a demonic attack upon Paul. That might well have been the damage caused within that church at Corinth when he spent so much of his time and energy and effort in trying to build into those people, and yet they reject him until this time. Here's the thing, we don't know exactly what it was. Because if we did know, then we would identify that as a thorn in the flesh, and then everything else that we suffer would be something else, wouldn't it? Wouldn't we have a tendency to talk about that specifically? So we don't know what this is, but this is really devastating to Paul. Now, let me ask you a question. Who do you think is closer to God? Would you think that the Apostle Paul would be closer to God than maybe you and I might be? Well, we probably would have a tendency to think that, wouldn't we? And Paul asked Jesus to do something about this thorn in the flesh, and yet God doesn't do anything. In fact, he goes on to write that 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Now just think about this. If I ask God to do something 3 times and he doesn't respond, well, you go, well, Neil's not very spiritual. I understand that, and God's not going to move because I'm not that important. But we have the Apostle Paul who wrote what? Most of the New Testament, who had started all of these churches through these missionary journeys, and you would think of all the people that God would want to do something good for or nice for or benefit, you would think that it might be Paul. And Paul here says 3 times I pleaded with the Lord. Now, I don't know if it was just 3 times and he stopped because Jesus prayed 3 times so the Lord had removed the cup of going through the cross. Maybe that was enough for Paul. And Paul said, well, you know what? If God wouldn't do that for Jesus, then why should I expect to ask him more times? I don't know. But here's what I know. There's pain and there's struggle and there's difficulty and there's hurt. And there's the feeling that if Paul could have this removed from him, that he would do so much better. That he would accomplish so much more if he could just get rid of this little thing. And he asks God to do that, and for whatever reason, God chooses not to. In fact, he gets an answer. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Then Paul, who was boasting about all the things that he could boast about, though he doesn't, he says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulty. Some translations say that he takes pleasure in these weaknesses. Some will say that he is content in these weaknesses, in these insults, in these hardships, in these persecutions. Not because he enjoys pain, not because he enjoys insults, not because he enjoys hardships, not because he enjoys persecutions, but because when he is weak, God becomes strong in him. Now, what's the whole point of this? Well, let me sit down in the Thanksgiving chair and see if I can make you understand it, all right? Sometimes you and I pray that God will come and show up and make everything right for us. We have that great prayer of, Lord, make me healthy, wealthy, and wise, which is not scriptural, by the way. That's American. That's what that is. And somehow we think that when God does those things in our life, that we should turn around and thank him for all the benefit, all the blessing, all the good stuff. And we should. But the Apostle Paul has learned something, that it is because of difficulties and challenges and pain that God is able to do something in his life that he might not have been able to do any other way. So instead of just being thankful to God when he does good things and angry when he does the things you don't want done or the bad things, we should be thankful for all the things that he does, including the bad things, or what we would think are bad. The things that he allows to happen into our life, because those things have a tendency to transform us more than the good things. I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, one of our staff members came to me, and they're working on an advanced degree, and so they're working on a project. And so they were looking to interview a Christian leader, and they couldn't find one, so they came to my office and asked me if I would talk to them. And so I'm like, well, I guess. And so they have all these academic questions, and we go through all these things, and I'm waxing eloquently about my abilities of leadership and my philosophy and my theology of leadership and how all that works and how you're supposed to do things, and on and on and on. And I'm sounding really, really good. And I'm even impressed with myself at that moment, how good I'm sounding. And I'm like, somebody should be writing this down and putting it in a book and mailing it to somebody, because it was good stuff. And then they asked this question: if you could do it over again in your leadership and in your strategy and what you've done in ministry and all those kind of things, what would you do differently? And that just kind of caused me to pause for just a moment. And I had one of those television moments where you see the person sitting there, and then there's just like this little thought bubble that comes up to the side, right? You know what I'm talking about? And then it kind of replays all those kind of things. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen TV, right? You understand? Yeah, okay. Because I started thinking about all of the challenges that I've had in ministry. You see, I'm pretty hard-headed, in case you don't know that, and I kind of think that I'm right most of the time, because I am, but I think that I'm right during those times. And I started thinking back about all of the challenges that has caused me in ministry. And I remember in seminary, I had taken a job as a music and youth minister while in seminary, and so I'm doing this little gig, and I'm dealing with a pastor who is declining in his mental capacities, unfortunately, because of his health, and I was not smart enough to understand those things. And I remember the arguments that he and I would get into, so much so that after I left, he was telling somebody else that he had never wanted to punch somebody as much in his life as he wanted to punch his music and youth minister. And so I look back upon that with great excitement of those days. I still think I could have taken him if he'd have punched me, but he wanted to do that. And after going through that experience, I decided, you know what? I'm not going to go into youth and music ministry. And so, Lord, don't let me do that again. Then I graduated, and when you graduate from seminary, for some reason you think you're smart. For some reason, I don't know why you think that, but you think that you're the next Billy Graham or the next whoever, and so I go to this particular small church, and they did not sense that in me, and so we had some real struggles there. In fact, after that first church, I'd been there 2 years, and I was thinking, like, Lord, did you call the right guy on this? And I came about that close to quitting ministry and going back and teaching in seminary or college or selling cars or asking, do you want fries with that? I mean, I was about to do just about anything else besides deal with God's people. I should have, and thought about, well, maybe I should go get a degree, another degree, and go do those things. And so I nearly walked away after that experience. Then I rolled into a church situation where the pastor had brought me in to be the next pastor after he retired. But after about 6 months, he decided that he wasn't going to retire. And so after about 18 months, he and I were still kind of struggling. And, the chairman of deacons had to take us to lunch and said, you guys aren't really getting along, are you? And if your chairman of deacons is noticing something, then there's probably kind of a big problem. And so at that point, I was going to say, you know what, I really have to go do something else. I really can't accomplish this in ministry. I'm going to quit because I'm not any good at this, and I'm going to go do something else, or at least I can make a living and be happy. And so I tried out for the Dallas Cowboys to be their quarterback, and that didn't work out. There's still an opportunity this year, though, so don't think that I'm throwing that out. There's a chance that I may look at that. But I almost quit then because of just the difficulty and the challenge of how bad all those things were. And then the Lord did some amazing things in my life and allowed me to go to a particular church, and the Lord healed spiritually and emotionally, all of those kind of things in me, and that allows me to sit where I'm sitting now in this congregation. And so all that's going through my mind is that person's just kind of looking at me like, are you still here? You've lost it or whatever. And then I was able to say this, even though my response to that person after I came back to reality was this, you know what, even if I know now what I knew then, or knew then what I know now, whatever, how that ever works in that thing, and even though I can see how those were not choices, not good choices that I made in those times, and if I had to do it over again, looking back, at some point I would say, yeah, why in the world did you ever do this? You should know better about yourself, that would have never worked. And then why did you do this? That just didn't make any sense either. And I look back at all those kind of things, but you know what the truth is? If I hadn't have experienced all of those things, all of that pain, all that difficulty, and all that challenge, I could not be where God would have me now. Because here's the truth. God has poured out some unique successes, if you will, in our congregation the last 4 years. Pretty amazing what God has done. But because I've gone through all those experiences that I've gone through, I know that it has nothing to do with me. And if I hadn't have gone through those experiences and I would have reached the point that we are right now, I would have a tendency, knowing myself, thinking, you know what, Neil, you're pretty good. Look how smart you are. Look how brilliant you are. Look how sharp you are that God's able to allow you to do all these things. And for some reason, I would have thought, if I hadn't gone through those experiences, that all the good things we've had right now have been because of my leadership, but because I've gone through all that pain, all that difficulty, and all that challenge, you know what I realized? This is about God. It's not about me. It's not about my success. It's not about how good I am or whatever I can or can't do. It's about God choosing to be strong when we are what? Weak. And so I couldn't believe I responded this way, but I said, you know what? I wouldn't change, had my fingers crossed, I wouldn't change a thing. That's what it means to be content with hurts and insults and pains and persecutions. And this Thanksgiving, when you pull out this chair and you begin to talk about what you're going to be thankful for, and I don't know if your family has a tradition, everybody's got to stand there and be thankful for something. I don't know what it is. Tonight, we, after our Thanksgiving dinner, will come back in here and you'll get a chance to figuratively sit in the Thanksgiving chair and share what God has done in your life very briefly tonight, and to be thankful and give Him praise and glory as we are thankful for all the things that God has done. But when you sit in this chair, my challenge for you is not to just think about the good things. Not just think about the times when, you know, the quarterback is able to score the touchdown for you at the last minute and win the game in the second overtime. Not just when you've had a difficulty and a challenge and a pain, and then God does come back and He wipes away all of the difficulty, all the ugliness of all that kind of stuff. I want you to be thankful in that second mile, not the first mile. And be thankful not for all of the good stuff, but to be thankful for the challenges and the pain and the difficulties that you have faced. Not because you enjoy pain. Not because you sign up for a trip of getting hurt. Not because you sign up and say, yeah, kick me or insult me. I'm not saying those things. But that we should be thankful for those circumstances, because it is through those that God shows Himself strong. And you and I think we're so strong sometimes that we don't allow Him to be strong in our life. And it's only when we have to become weak that He becomes strong in our life. That is what we should be thankful for. We should resist the move from our country away from Thanksgiving to Turkey Day. We should resist that as Christians. We should resist putting up our Christmas lights until we've thanked God for what He has done in Thanksgiving. But it should be more than just thanking God for all of the good stuff and the blessing and the happiness and the wealth and the health, but we should be thankful to God for the challenge and for the difficulty and for the insult and for the persecution, because it is in that we become weak and He shows Himself strong. All because God loves us enough not to leave us where He finds us, but to take us where He can make us great, because we become like Christ and experience the suffering in this world.